dive, and things are really starting to heat up at the top of Serie A.
Yeah, definitely. Even with one match still to play in this match week, you've got Bologna and Napoli going head-to-head still.
Right.
But the race for the Champions League spots is just getting tighter and tighter.
Yeah, and it's not even really the top two, right? We can kind of assume, Inter and Napoli are probably going to be there at the end of the season, but it's those spots right behind them.
Yeah, it's the battle for third and fourth place.
Right, exactly. And you've got some big names, some surprising names. I mean, Bologna, they're sitting fourth right now.
Yeah, they're on an incredible run of form.
Incredible run, yeah. And they could potentially even end this week in third place, depending on what happens in that game against Napoli.
Yeah.
So much is up in the air.
And you mentioned some big names. I mean, you've got Juventus, who are right there in the mix.
Yeah.
They drew with Roma on the weekend. Roma were on a 7-game winning streak.
7 straight wins, yeah.
So that was a big result for Juventus.
Big result, yeah. It kind of stopped Roma's momentum and gave Juventus a little bit of a boost.
Exactly. And then you had that other massive result with Lazio beating Atalanta in Bergamo.
Right, and that's shaking things up even more because Atalanta were sitting comfortably in third for a while.
They were looking like a pretty safe bet for Champions League football next season. But now suddenly you look at the table and there are 6 teams, all within just a few points of each other, all fighting for those 2 remaining spots.
So let's dive into some of these teams a little bit deeper. Let's start with Juventus, because I think you mentioned that draw against Roma, and it was just a point. But it feels like a lot of people are looking at that as a real sign of progress for Juventus.
Right.
They had that win against Genoa before that. But even then, it sounds like the performance wasn't that convincing. But against Roma, it seems like something clicked.
Yeah.
Playing players in their proper positions, picking the team on form.
Yeah, and, for me, it's kind of crazy to think that a team with the depth of Juventus could even be in this position where they're fighting for a Champions League spot.
Yeah.
They've got guys like Colomwani, Coop Miners, Cambiaso coming off the bench. Players like Douglas Luiz and Conchicao didn't even get on the pitch.
Wow.
I mean, you look at that and you think, how are they not 10 points clear in third place?
Right. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Mm.
And, I read somewhere that the previous coach, Motta, he said when he left that they were only like 1 point off the Champions League places.
Yeah.
So on paper, it doesn't look as bad. But you get the feeling that with the quality they have, they should be doing so much better. And then you look at some of those results earlier in the season, dropping points against teams like, what was it, PSV and Empoli, right?
Yeah, those are the games that come back to bite you, You can't afford to slip up against those so-called lesser teams if you're serious about challenging for the top spots.
It shows you the difference between potential and actually realizing it. And yeah, it's not just about being close. It's about performing consistently and getting the results when it matters.
Exactly. And that's what seems to be happening now with Juventus. They're starting to find that consistency.
Okay, well, let's move on to another team that's had a really, interesting few weeks, and that's Atalanta. Because it feels like, just a few weeks ago, we were talking about them as potential title contenders, and now they're really, really struggling to hold on to a Champions League spot.
Yeah, it's been a dramatic turnaround, hasn't it? I mean, they haven't won at home since December 22nd.
Wow.
And they've lost their last 3 league games. And we're not just talking about narrow defeats. Their performances have been really poor. It's like that exciting Atalanta team that we all knew, and the team that played with so much attacking flair, it's just disappeared.
Yeah, you can't help but wonder if Gasperini, the coach, his announcement about not renewing his contract, whether that's had an impact on the players, if it's maybe, created a bit of uncertainty or lack of focus.
It could be a factor, for sure, but I think there are probably deeper issues at play here. Maybe there's some tension within the squad, or maybe the players are just tired after such a long season. It's hard to say for sure, but they definitely need to find a way to turn things around quickly. Otherwise, they risk throwing away what was shaping up to be a really special season.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we focused on a couple of those teams in that chasing pack, but let's zoom out a little bit and look at Serie A as a whole. And one thing that really stands out to me is, you mentioned a couple of big results, but it was a weekend of draws, wasn't it?
It really was. 6 out of the 9 games played ended in a draw.
6.
And, we still got that Bologna-Napoli game to come, which, who knows, that could be a draw as well.
Right.
It's becoming a bit of a trend in Serie A, actually. Saw a lot of draws last season as well.
Yeah, well, let's break it down a little bit. You've got You had some surprising results, right? Monza, who are already relegated, they lost, and Udinese, who are pretty much safe, they lost as well.
Right. And then you have those teams who really needed a win, like Como. They got a vital victory to, basically secure their safety for next season.
Yeah.
And Genoa also picked up 3 points. And then, of course, you have that big win for Lazio against Atalanta,
Right.
which, I think that result might just have saved their coach's job.
Yeah, possibly. And then in terms of the draws, you had sort of what you might call the vanilla draws, the Empoli-Cagliari game. Apparently that was pretty dull.
Yeah, the fans weren't too happy with that one.
Yeah, understandably. And then you had, the kind of draws that are born out of fear, the Lecce Venezia game, where it felt like both teams were so worried about losing that they didn't really try to win.
And the fans there weren't happy either. They felt like the team was prioritizing, financial security over actually trying to achieve something on the pitch.
Right. And then you had the tactical stalemate between Roma and Juventus, which I guess, you expect from two big teams.
Two well-organized teams canceling each other out.
And then a, relatively uneventful draw between Milan and Fiorentina.
Right.
And then a Torino-Verona match, which I heard was actually quite an exciting game.
And plenty of action.
Despite it ending in a draw.
Yeah.
But the one that really caught my eye was the Parma-Inter game, because that had so many talking points.
It did. And I think a lot of the focus has been on the substitutions made by Inter's coach, or his assistant rather, because he was suspended for this game.
Right.
But those substitutions, they happened while Inter were winning, and they were quite strange. They made a bunch of changes all at once, and it really seemed to disrupt their rhythm.
Yeah, it seemed to backfire.
It did. And you can't help but wonder if maybe their focus had already shifted to the Champions League, because they have a big game coming up.
I was thinking the same thing. In Parma, they took full advantage, right? They got those 2 goals, Bernabé scored, and then Andrejka.
They did. And it just shows you how, even a team like Inter, who are, challenging for trophies, they can be vulnerable if they take their foot off the gas even for a moment.
And it seems like that's been a bit of a pattern for Inter this season, hasn't it? They go ahead, they look comfortable, and then in the second half, they just seem to fade away.
It does seem to be a recurring theme, and I think there are a few possible explanations for that. Maybe it's fatigue, like you said, or maybe it's a subconscious shift in focus towards other competitions. Maybe there's even a bit of fear of injuries creeping in.
Right. Protecting those key players.
Yeah, exactly. But whatever the reason, it cost them 2 crucial points against Parma. And now, all their attention will be on that Champions League game. But you have to give Parma credit. They played well, especially those players you mentioned, Pellegrino, Bernabé, Andrej Josanka. They were excellent.
Yeah, they really were. And this actually brings up another point about Inter. Because, they got a lot of experienced players, but some of those key players are getting on a bit, aren't they? You look at guys like Darmian, Acerbi, Mkhitaryan. They're all over 30.
They are. And that can lead to inconsistency, especially at this stage of the season when the games are coming thick and fast.
Right, yeah. And Inzaghi, the coach, he's done a great job overall, but I think there's still this question mark over his in-game management, especially his substitutions.
Yeah, there have been a few times this season where his decisions haven't really worked out.
Right. So, maybe that's something for them to work on going forward. Anyway, let's talk about the game that everyone's waiting for, Bologna against Napoli. This feels like it's much more than just a game, right?
It's huge. It's huge for both teams. For Bologna, it's a chance to really cement their place in the top 4 and even potentially move into 3rd place. They haven't been this high up the table at this stage of the season since 1997.
Wow.
So for them, it's a massive opportunity. And for Napoli, well, it's all about maintaining their momentum in the title race. The pressure is on them to get a result.
It's amazing how Bologna have turned things around.
Yeah.
They weren't really considered to be a threat at the start of the season, and now they're right up there with the big boys.
It's a testament to the coach. He's done a fantastic job. And they've got some really talented players as well. And Napoli will have to be wary of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Napoli are going to be without their coach, Conte. He's suspended, right?
He is, yeah. But his assistant has taken charge before, and they've got a pretty good record with him in the dugout.
Oh, okay.
So I don't think they'll be too worried about that.
And tactically, what are we expecting?
Well, it looks like Napoli might go back to a 4-3-3 formation for this one. They've been experimenting a bit lately, but I think they'll want to go with something more familiar for such a big game.
It'll be interesting to see how the two coaches approach this game tactically. Because, Conte, he's known for his very structured, organized approach, whereas the Bologna coach is a bit more, flexible, a bit more adaptable.
Yeah, it's a real clash of styles. And that's what makes this game so intriguing because you just don't know what to expect. I mean, could we see an upset? Could Bologna, really throw a spanner in the works?
It's possible. And if they did, it would have huge implications for Napoli. It would put even more pressure on them in those remaining games.
Absolutely. And, it's funny you mentioned upsets because it was actually against Bologna back in April of 2022 that Inter lost the Scudetto.
Oh, wow.
So, this fixture has a history of producing surprising results.
That is interesting. All right, well, while we're talking about those key games at the top of the table, let's just touch on the Roma-Juventus game again briefly. That draw means that Roma are now unbeaten in 8 games.
Yeah, that's a really impressive run.
Which, puts them in a great position going into that massive derby game against Lazio next week.
Yeah, that's going to be a huge game. The atmosphere is going to be electric.
Yeah. Juventus, they're still looking a little bit shaky at the back, especially from set pieces.
They are, yeah. That's something they need to work on.
And Vlahovic, he's still not quite firing on all cylinders, is he?
No, he hasn't been at his best lately. And even when they brought on Coop Miners, he didn't really make much of an impact.
Right, yeah. But it's still early days for the new coach, so, maybe things will start to click soon. And to be fair to Juventus, they did look a lot better in that game against Roma.
They did. They played with more intensity, more purpose.
Right.
And the players seem to have bought into the new coach's ideas.
And then we had that, that rather bizarre interview from the former Juventus coach, Motta. He was very critical of the club. And the timing of it, just after he'd been sacked, it all seemed a bit strange, a bit self-serving.
Yeah, I'm not sure what he was trying to achieve with that.
But the bottom line is that both Roma and Juventus gained a point on Atalanta and Bologna, and those 2 points could be crucial come the end of the season.
They could be. And speaking of Atalanta, I mean, they're on a terrible run at the moment. 3 straight defeats, and they haven't even scored a goal in any of those games. That's their worst run since 2014.
Wow.
And it's not like they've been hit by a lot of injuries or anything like that. They've got pretty much a full squad to choose from. So you have to start looking at other factors. Maybe there are issues in the dressing room, or maybe there's a problem with the coach's relationship with the players.
Yeah. And you can't ignore Gasperini's comments in the press lately. He's been very critical of the club.
Yeah.
Very frustrated. It almost feels like he's trying to force his way out.
Yeah, it's possible. And it's interesting because despite his success at Atalanta, he hasn't really been linked with any other big jobs. There were rumors that he might go to, a club like Roma or Napoli, but nothing seems to have come of that.
So maybe his reputation has taken a bit of a hit. Or maybe it's just a case of him being too closely associated with Atalanta.
Yeah, it's hard to say, but the situation is definitely one to watch.
Right. Well, it's all getting very, very interesting at the top of Serie A, isn't it? And, who would have thought that we'd be talking about Atalanta potentially missing out on the Champions League?
It just goes to show that in football, anything can happen. 1 minute you're flying high, the next you're in free fall.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bologna, they're the surprise package this season. They're the ones who are really exceeding expectations.
They are. And Juventus are showing signs of life again, while Inter are, well, they're still Inter. They're capable of beating anyone, but they're also capable of dropping points against anyone.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So it's all to play for in these last few weeks of the season. And, for me, it's not just about who qualifies for the Champions League or who wins the title. It's about the stories behind those achievements, the struggles, the triumphs, the human drama that unfolds on and off the pitch.
It's about those moments that capture the imagination, those moments that make you love the game.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And for the neutral, it doesn't get much better than this. We've got a title race that's going down to the wire, a fight for the Champions League spots that's incredibly tight, and, we've even got a relegation battle that's still going on.
Right, yeah. And who knows, maybe we'll even see another shock result like that Inter-Bologna game from a couple of years ago.
Anything is possible.
And that's what makes football so captivating, isn't it? The unpredictability, the passion, the sheer drama of it all.
It makes you think, doesn't it? Why do we put ourselves through this? The highs, the lows, the roller coaster of emotion. But I think that's part of the appeal. We're drawn to the drama, the uncertainty. Because in the end, that's what makes it all worthwhile.
It's a good point, yeah. And for these teams, these last few games, they're not just about points on a table. They're about legacies. They're about, cementing their place in history or avoiding, a season that's remembered for all the wrong reasons.
Exactly. And I think that's what we'll see in these final weeks. We'll see teams fighting for every inch of the pitch because the stakes are so high.
Absolutely. And we'll be here to witness it all. So join us again next week for another deep dive as we break down all the action and analyze the key talking points from what's sure to be another thrilling round of Serie A football.
We'll see you then.
See you then.